Well, hello everyone. Good to see y'all again. Welcome to the campfire. You know, we're all just kind of doing the same thing that you are. We're looking for some fun tonight, and looking to hang out with some friends and tell some stories and maybe have a few laughs. Well, we're going to do some more of the same here. And what we're going to do is we're going to read you some of this story. This Thomas Robinette, the Bigfoot Hunter by Joe Flippo. We worked our way up to chapter 10 and it's starting to get pretty darn exciting. So get yourself a place to sit, you know the routine, and we'll get started here. The pack is back. Now, after resting and bathing in the hot springs inside the cave for a day, the hunters were refreshed and they were ready to return to their task. Alpha, the new leader, sent out scouts to check for sasquatches before venturing any farther back into Danae's domain. Now that Daw was no more, they knew that Danae must now be the leader of the Saqui. That was the only way the Alpha could rationalize why a Saqui could be in a Washi village. Danae, who was said to always have been strange, must be forming an alliance with the Washis, thought Alpha. And before leading his hunters into a trap, he needed to know if there was a trap. As he thought about this, Beta, his newly chosen second in command, approached him. Alpha, Beta began, we need to send out scouts to look over the Washi village to know if any have returned. I agree, answered Alpha. Take 5 Omegas and go scout ahead and report to me what you find. Now be careful, as the Saquis may be planning to ambush us. Gawa broke the peace. We are as guilty as he is because we followed him below to Daw's domain after we killed Daw. Do not lead any Sasquis back to our pack. The rest of us will stay here until you return. If you're not back in 3 days, then I will know that you're dead or you're a captive. Now, if you're captured alive, you must not give them any information. Kill any Omegas that tries before he can. I understand, Alpha, acknowledged Beta as he called over 5 Omegas and led them out of the cave. Tonight, Beta was the leader of his squad. His mini-pack would hunt as they searched for any clue that would help them find their fallen leader and his sons. There were only thoughts of imaged glory flowing through his mind as the 6 hunters left out in a show of bravado. After they got out of the line of sight of the temporary lair, Beta slowed the Omegas down to a slow walk. Tonight we hunt, little brothers, he said. When we bring back meat, we will be the heroes of our camp. However, while we hunt, keep a nose out for signs of the Saqui. Should we bring back a Saqui, we will be even more than heroes. Oric hasn't eaten Saqui in many moons. But Beta, one of the Omegas stated, Oric is far away, and we are supposed to be searching for Gawa and his 4 sons. Yes, little brother, answered Beta, but if we take Oric, his first Sasqui prisoner, he will reward us more than if we brought back Gawa and his sons. Vengeance runs deep in the veins of Oric. What greater vengeance can he have than to eat Saqui meat after they killed his cherished son and his grandsons? And without saying another word, the advanced scouting party ran off into the night as it hunted for an innocent victim to prey upon. Each member had dreams of the hunt as their noses told them what their eyes couldn't perceive. None of them would settle for rabbit blood on this night. Neither deer blood, elk blood, or even strong and pungent bear blood would sate their bloodthirst. On this night, they were after the king of the forest. In their minds, Danae, son of Daw, son of all Sasqui ancestors, was their quarry. Only his blood could satisfy the vengeance of Oric. Delusions of grandeur flooded their minds, just as adrenaline flooded their veins. As the scouting party roamed throughout the countryside that night, they were on the lookout for any prey that would gain them battle glory. They wouldn't be satisfied with just a meat kill. They wouldn't be satisfied with just a predatory fight with a bear, a moose, or a mountain lion. What they desired was finding some way to gain the gratitude of Oric now that he had retaken his throne. They searched throughout the forest for an easy target. After a while, a new scent floated across the wind. The odor was thick with pheromones, and there was a dominant trait to it. The smell was both human and canine. Could it be that another wolf hunter was trying to take the pack's glory, wondered Beta? Maybe Alpha didn't trust their ability and sent out someone else to make sure that they were obeying his orders. Maybe the other hunter was planning to sabotage their plans. The scent definitely had the smell of a strong hunter. Could it be that there was a lone hunter in these woods that wasn't associated with Oric? According to ancient law, all hunters must be subject to Oric. It's just the way of things. Beta called to his roaming pack. As they answered, each of them turned back and ran to rendezvous with their boss. They also picked up on the odor. After grouping back together, the scouting party began its hunt. As they closed in on their quarry, the odor became stronger. This hunter was definitely an alpha, even if he was a lone wolf. Finally, their collective noses told them that their prey was just beyond the underbrush. The time for fun and games had passed. Chapter 11, Meeting the Old Man of the Woods. As Jimmy and Jake began their trek up the mountain, Jimmy found himself watching Jake's action increasingly. Although Jimmy had a good nose, keen hearing, and above-average sight, he also knew that compared to Jake's abilities, he was just a babe in the woods. He also took notice of the cautious pace that the big white shepherd had settled into. Jimmy could tell that Jake was picking up on some unfamiliar smells by the way he held his ears in an inquisitive manner. Jimmy also admired the facts that, unlike his hunting dogs, Jake didn't bark or make other vocalizations while in the wild. The white shepherd's coat had a faint glow in the moonlight as he slipped quietly through the trees. His ancestors would have considered Jake a white wolf and maybe even a warrior spirit that was meant to help or protect him. After several miles of searching for signs of any kind of track, Jimmy sat down behind a large pine tree and called the dog over to him. The pine trees had been broken about 8 foot from its roots and was laying behind the tree's trunk. Jake was hesitant on approaching Jimmy, but he came over and he laid down beside him as Jimmy sat to rest for a while. Jimmy pulled off his hat and poured a small amount of water from his canteen into it and shared a drink with the dog. Now, while Jake was lapping up his water, Jimmy rubbed the back of Jake's ears. As the moon went behind a cloud, Jake's ears perked up. Suddenly, he noticed a large, hairy figure inside the underbrush behind the tree. Jake lunged to his feet and baring his teeth and growling. Then he caught a pungent, canine-type odor that was totally unfamiliar to him. But his nose alerted to danger, and before Jimmy could move, Jake lunged at the figure over Jimmy's left shoulder. In surprise, Jimmy jumped to his feet, but he had heard no noise. He had smelled nothing. He had seen no indication of danger except for the dog's response to it. Spinning around in the direction that Jake had leapt, Jimmy heard an audible thump, a whimper from Jake, and silence. Instinct told him that Jake was either dead or hurt. Silence made him think the worst. As he tried to bring his rifle up to bear down on whatever the danger was, Jimmy heard one heavy step behind him. As he turned to face his attacker, he managed to fire off one shot before he fell into a deep blackness. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was a large, hairy silhouette, outlined by the moon, and every detail to the palm that was reaching for his head. Thomas had observed Jimmy and Jake's progress up the mountains until the terrain and the night made this picture and the audio unreliable. After attempting to try to make contact with Jake, he finally cut off his computer and he resigned Jake to take care of Jimmy. In the short time that Jimmy had been acquainted with Thomas, he had noticed that Jimmy had developed an affectionate attitude toward his dog. He also knew that Jake was an affection hog, so that those two'd get along just fine. He'd been investigating the ransacked camp one more time when he heard the shot echoing down the mountain. "What the?" Owen exclaimed as he grabbed for his rifle that he had just cleaned and reloaded. "Well, that's got to be Jimmy," Emery stated. He must have found something and he's signaling us." "Well, let's get on up there then," Thomas commanded. Everyone dropped what they were doing, loaded up into the razors, and headed up toward where the tracker and the dog had last been seen. After reaching the tree line, Owen stopped the razor that he was driving. He and Easton got out and looked at the ground for signs of Jimmy's tracks. He had seen Jimmy purposely leaving a marked trail for him in case they needed to find him and Jake quickly. The trail was easy to see in the razor's headlights. After the two men returned back to the razor, they led the others up the mountain. Thomas and Emery had deposited themselves in the back seats behind Owen and Easton, respectively, so they could also see the blaze trail. The side-by-sides that carried this group of men were much more agile than full-size vehicles, but the going was still slow due to the fact that Jimmy and Jake, they hadn't adhered to any kind of animal trail. Their bushwhacking caused some difficulties as the party had to traverse around fallen trees or muddy swamps that the tracker and the dog had easily crossed on rocks or fallen tree trunks. After traveling slowly for over half of an hour, Easton jumped out of the razor while Owen navigated around a broken oak tree. As Easton guided Owen and directed his movements so that the razor didn't roll, he noticed something in the mud. It was a large human footprint that was slowly filling up with water from the mud hole that they were trying to avoid. "Look at this!" exclaimed Easton as he handed his phone to Thomas. On the screen, Thomas saw a picture of Easton's foot placed next to the footprint of a human-type animal. The footprint was easily twice as wide as Easton's combat boot and at least 40% longer. "So what do you make of it?" Thomas asked as he handed the phone back to Emery. "Looks like something is tracking our boy," Easton stated. Then he pointed out the tracks left by the creature as it walked on up the trail, clearly tracking Jimmy and Jack. "Do you think it may be a Sasquatch?" asked Emery. "Before today," admitted Thomas, "I would have bet my life on it. However, since listening to Jimmy earlier—" Thomas let the sentence finish itself in his companions' heads. "Send the others back," Thomas instructed Emery. "If this is a Sasquatch, then a lot of lights and noise and personnel will just be detrimental. If it ain't a Sasquatch, then the security detail that we left behind is going to need all the help that they can get. Send word back to the main camp to send more security assets out to the Sinclair camp immediately. The more the merrier." After advising the others to return to the Sinclair camp, Emery instructed the one he put in charge to contact Tom Hennessy at the main camp. Instruct him to send more men and told them to be armed to take out tanks. As the other four razors retreated back to the camp, Thomas instructed Owen to continue on up the trail. After about 15 minutes, they came upon an area that had a broken pine tree where Jimmy had stopped to drink some water. "Now look at this," Owen said as he came from around the broken pine tree. In his hand was the broken camera that had been strapped to Jake's head. Blood began to dry on it, but had not done so completely. "Now look over here," Emery called out. "I found the cartridge where it was ejected from Jimmy's rifle." "I found the rifle," Thomas called after walking behind the fallen tree. "It's been bent in half and twisted." He brought out the mangled gun and handed it to Owen. The rifle was twisted so tightly that the magazine couldn't be released from the frame. The scene looked bad. "Poor Jimmy," thought Easton. "Poor Jake," thought Thomas. As the four men stood there in their own thoughts, they were shaken back to reality by a deep and gravelly voice. "No worry," said the voice. "Umquah no dead. Umquah safe. Four-legged no dead. Come here, me." The impossibly deep and gravelly voice was oddly easy to comprehend. In shock, the men turned around to see an 8-foot-tall, hairy man standing just inside of the underbrush. He had shoulders 4 feet wide, and his forearms were as big as any of their waists. His hands were the size of matured pumpkins and out of proportion to his body, in comparison with a human's hands. The length of his forearms and his shins were noticeably shorter than his upper arms and thighs. As the men stood gaping at him, the creature urged them to action. "Come here, me," he repeated. "You have others waiting. Time short. Must follow me." Still affected by the shock of seeing a giant, hairy man speak to them, the quartet moved to follow the large creature. And once inside the underbrush, the four men were seized by unseen hairy hands. Unceremoniously thrown over their captors' shoulders, they found themselves carried up the mountain at an incomprehensible speed. Not once were they scratched by a low-hanging branch nor thorns while they were being swept through the dark wilderness at night. Neither did it look as if their captors were purposely avoiding the underbrush either. The creatures seemed to know instinctively where to run, where to charge through gaps in the brush, and where to jump over logs or rock outcroppings. What amazed Thomas the most was that these creatures were accelerating as they ran uphill. They were running uphill as fast, as if not faster, than a human could run downhill. Thomas had ridden horses as a younger man, but not even a horse mountain bred was able to accelerate uphill. It was also unreal how smoothly these creatures moved. They were like fluid oil passing along the terrain. Not once was he bounced around, not once was he jostled. Now he couldn't understand how these creatures could run so fast in these dark mountains and not trip up. Finally, the creatures arrived at the mouth of a cave that was along a narrow walking path along the side of a bare rock face. Now, Thomas hadn't noticed the walkway until he was put down. His captors had not even slowed down a step as they came along the trail. Looking around, he could see the Sinclair camp much farther down the slope. The whole campsite was lit up like a small metropolis. Although he couldn't hear any helicopters, he knew that there were ground reinforcements arriving. The caravan of troop transport vehicles could still be seen coming from the direction of the main camp at Paradise Creek. And once the vehicles arrived, Thomas noticed that they were parked with their headlights facing up into the wilderness and circling the camp. Men could barely fit between them, so the security team had made a pretty good fortification. From behind them, the men were startled by a woman's voice calling out to them. "Emery," she squealed with excitement, "you came for us." The men turned around to see Katie Sinclair running towards Emery Letson. When she reached him, she threw her arms around him and held him so tightly that Thomas thought she was going to squeeze the life out of him. From inside the cave, Mary Ann, Kevin, and Eric joined the group standing just outside. Kevin walked over to Emery and embraced him in a tight hug as well. "Now, I was wondering what it would take to get you out of that office," Kevin stated. "I'm sure glad to see you here. Now I can relax, and I know that everything's going to be all right." The relief in Kevin's voice was just almost tangible. Hurriedly, the large, hairy man told everyone to get inside of the cave. The pre-dawn sunlight was just peeking above the silhouetted mountains. "Danger close," Danae said. "If man's below lucky, got one more day." After everyone had retreated to the inner caverns of the cave, the entrance was closed to a narrow slit of light by unseen hands that moved enormous boulders. Everyone except the humans and the warrior sasquatches were sent deeper into the mountain caverns. Thomas didn't know what to expect yet, but he was either a guest inside this community or he'd been captured by an honorable soul, whatever he may be. As they were instructed to sit down, older females brought the new arrivals wet moss to suck the moisture from. Mary Ann handed the men a canteen full of water, and as the men passed the water around, they listened to Eric, who told them about their ordeal. As Eric relayed each detail, Thomas was amazed at how human these creatures seemed to be. Although he wasn't an anthropologist anywhere close to the caliber of Kevin or Eric, he noticed things that to him appeared to be a window into the ancestry of the human species. He even imagined that these same activities were unchanged since the dawn of time. Unlike human civilizations, these creatures didn't have things like fashion or art or style that repeats itself every so many generations. These creatures have lived under the sky for eons in the same manner as their first ancestors had. They were absolutely adapted to the natural life on this earth. They didn't need fire. That was the difference between them and us, he thought. Now, after almost 3 hours of listening to Eric's monologue, Danae returned to notify the humans that they needed to retreat into the belly of the mountains to rest. He then took the time to introduce himself, his family, and his warriors. When he introduced Babo, he made a big display showing them his little brother. His other brothers had died as infants until Babu came into the world. By that time, Da was an older man, and it was Danae's first job to keep his baby out of danger, trouble, mishaps. Thomas was about to object to staying the day inside the cave system instead of going back to the Sinclair camp. Seeing his host about to turn and walk away, he started to ask him about that when Danae stopped and turned around. "When light come, sasquatches sleep," said Danae. "This day different. Sasquatches no sleep. Warriors hunt for hunters. Sasquatches save Umpqua and four-legged from hunters before hunters kill Umpqua and four-legged. Danae, bring Umpqua and four-legged here. Use magic. Heal." Without another word, Danae left the 8 humans alone inside of an inner cavern. A couple of minutes later, Danae and Babu brought in Jimmy and Jake. They carefully laid each one of the injured down. Thomas could see the injuries that Jimmy and Jake had sustained had been attended to, even if their attendants had only used moss and mud to treat them. Thomas took out his backpack and opened up his first aid kit and began treating his dog. Jake had been laying still with his eyes closed until he smelled Thomas. As Thomas began cleaning away the moss and the mud from his lacerations, Jake began whining for Thomas to rub his ear. Thomas spoke quietly to Jake and comforted him, as did his best to clean up his wounds. It was pretty cool down in the mountain, and Thomas was afraid that Jimmy and Jake may develop pneumonia if they didn't get warm soon. While Oric and Emery attended to Jimmy, Thomas began looking for something to burn. When he began his search, Katie asked him what he was looking for. He told her about how he wanted to build a fire and heat up the area so that Jimmy and the dog wouldn't get pneumonia. Now, she informed him how the Sasquatch believed that fire was the spirits summoned out of the wood and deemed very destructive to them. She was wary that their hosts would see the fire as either aggression or a curse. He asked her if they could talk to Danae about the possibility of having a fire somewhere, and she agreed to breach the subject using Oric as a translator. After discussing it with Oric, he agreed to help convey their need for a fire. Around mid-morning, Danae returned to the cavern that held the humans. Oric spoke with him about the need for a fire, and he explained how the fire would benefit Jimmy and the dog and how he would be responsible for any mishaps with the fire. At first, Danae was resistant to the idea of a fire. He'd seen how an uncontrolled fire could destroy everything in its path. The two compromised on a small room in the upper area of the cave system. The cavern comfortably accommodated around 15 human-sized people. There was an opening out to the sky on the roof besides the cliff wall for the smoke to escape. 3 preteen Sasquatch males were told to go out and collect some dried wood. They were instructed to break it into sections about 2 feet long, and they were also instructed to not go out into the wilderness, but to collect the wood from the area near the bottom of the cave system where the rain had carried down dead tree limbs during the spring floods. After the confused little ones brought their first armload of dried wood back to the cave, they were told why the wood was needed. When they learned that they were bringing wood to the washies so that the washies could make magic, bring the spirits of the wood out, they were excited. They went about their jobs with pride. They would be the first Sasquatch to ever learn to summon the wood spirits. The 3 males, all on the developmental level of 7-year-old humans, were affectionately called Eenie, Minnie, and Miney. When they had brought enough wood to keep the cave warm for a week, Owen told the 3 that he didn't need no mo wood, and he laughed. When the others heard the comment, they also laughed. So the trio of Sasquatch laughed too. Thomas fished 3 apples out of his bag and gave each one of them an apple as a reward for bringing the wood. The 3 boys accepted the apples as fair trade. Now, as the fire was built and its heat was stored inside of the rock walls, that atmosphere inside the cave became more cozy and more comfortable. The warmth of the air seeped down into Thomas's body. He became sleepy. And just as he was about to go to sleep, he felt a vibration inside his pocket. His phone was ringing. He looked down at his personal phone to discover that the screen was severely cracked. However, he could tell by the number that it was Sarah calling. "Hello, sweetheart," Thomas heard Sarah say when he answered the phone. "What are you doing?" "Well, honey," Thomas begins, "would you believe that I am in the top of a cave system building a fire with wood that baby sasquatches brought me while I'm waiting for mountain giants and werewolves to attack us?" Thomas laughed. He had used this technique before. Now he knew that Sarah isn't going to believe the first thing that he told her anyway. "You silly goose," Sarah joshed. "I'll bet you're held up in some lush hotel room, eating breakfast in bed and running up a room service on that company's expense." Sarah had laughed. Her laughter always made his situation better. The warmth of it warmed his soul then as well. "Well, you caught me red-handed," Thomas feigned guilt to her. "So when are you going to be home?" she said. "I have a surprise for you." "I'm just not exactly sure at this point, honey," he answered. "We have found some interesting things here, but if I had my guess, I would say within the week. I've been working really hard, and I haven't hardly had the time to even call you since I got here. Everything's okay here with me. Jake can't wait to get home so you can scratch his ears." "Well, sweetheart, you better hurry home, 'cause you left something turned on when you ran off." Thomas blushed when he realized the phone was on speaker. He assured her that he'd take care of that when he got home, and he hung up the phone. "What did you leave turned on at home?" Owen asked, feigning innocence and laughing. "We made sure the hose was cut off when we left, didn't we?" Easton asked, and he snickered. "Well, from the sound of it, Thomas," interjected Kevin, "you better have a plan before you get home. That woman's either going to hit you up for a lot of love or a lot of money, if I had to guess about it." Katie was blushing after hearing this conversation on the phone, and when the conversation had turned since Emery had reunited with her, she had been by his side the whole time. As a matter of fact, both Sinclair siblings were openly fond of Emery. That was a puzzle to Thomas. He couldn't figure out the angle, although he had already tried to reconcile their actions. He felt like they were either very closely related or they had grown up together. Emery didn't look like he could be much older than the two Sinclairs, but there definitely was a familiar resemblance. However, Emery's last name wasn't one that was normally associated with the world-renowned name Sinclair, so he was left at a loss. And while he was sitting there contemplating his thoughts, Mary Ann approached him and began helping him sort out the rest of the fuel wood according to the size and the length. "What kind of expert are you, Mr. Robinette?" Mary Ann asked him politely. "Well, what makes you think I'm an expert on anything?" Thomas replied with a question. "Well," Mary Ann continued, "everyone here is an expert in something. Katie and I are primatologists. We both have minors in botany. Kevin and Eric are anthropologists. It's plain to see that your two goons are security experts. We all know that Emery is an expert on everything. And your tracker over there, Jimmy, is not just a good guide, but is famous for his academics. That leaves just you and your dog. So what are you an expert at?" "Well, miss," Thomas replied, "I honestly ain't an expert at anything. I don't have any kind of degree. I haven't even been inside a college except for one day my high school took our senior class to the local community college to show us our opportunities there. Now, I'm pretty good at mechanics and figuring out how to fix stuff when it breaks, and I am good at hunting and fishing. Other than that, I'm just along for the ride. I see myself as the comic relief, as of late, though." Thomas grinned out of the side of his mouth. "Thomas is too modest," stated Emery. "He is, in fact, the world's premier expert on cryptozoological primates. I have listened to every seminar and podcast that he has been invited to speak on as a guest. It's my understanding that he never asked to participate in any of them, but was willing to share his accumulated knowledge with anyone that would listen with an open mind. As a matter of fact, he was our only plausible chance of finding your expedition when you all became missing." "Okay," Mary Ann stated. So you're a Bigfoot expert then? First off, nobody is an expert on Bigfoot because Bigfoot is a mythological beast that has a popular cult following. Years ago, I had an encounter with a female primate and her young that they weren't human. But they were too human to just be an ape. Now, I have spent half of my life, every bit of my adult life, trying to figure out what I saw. I've hunted these creatures across 2 decades and now 6 states. And up until this very experience, I have been firmly in the camp of Sasquatch being just an undiscovered ape. I have sat and I've watched them groom each other. I've watched them care for their young. I've had them steal my kills while hunting. I've had them throw everything from acorns to rocks the size of a fist. I've been chased out of the woods by them, and I have had them trade shiny rocks for fruit. What I don't know is what they are or where they fit into the evolutionary primate tree. Well, laughed Marianne, if nothing else, you're an expert at blunt honesty. But what about your dog? He's a superb animal that is no doubt well trained. Where does he fit into this scheme of things? Oh, that's simple, answered Thomas with a chuckle. He's the brains of the operation, and I'm the good-looking PR rep. He's my hunting buddy, and he is responsible for keeping me out of trouble. Sarah wouldn't let me run around here alone in the woods at night without Jake. About that time, a female Sasquatch entered into the outer area of the cave. She sat down an elk leg and pointed to Oric and signed for him to share it with the others. And after she left, Owen and Easton used several of the longer pieces of firewood to make a couple of forks and a skewer to hang the elk leg on to broil it. Now, Thomas hadn't realized how hungry he actually was until he smelled the juices cooking on the coals. The smell reminded him of the airplane ride from Mississippi when they ate steaks. As the meat began cooking and the fat dripping off the meat, Thomas took out a travel bowl for Jake and sat it under the elk leg so that the fat melted and ran into the bowl. As Owen cooked the leg, he also cut off excess fat from time to time and put it into the bowl for the dog. As the scent of cooking meat wafted through the air, Jimmy began to move around. Emery took out a steel camp mug from his bag and poured a little of the liquefied fat into it, added some water and a few small chunks of meat, and gave it to Jimmy after he sat up. Jimmy was quiet for a short while he was eating his elk meat and sipping the broth. It seemed like a dream when he woke up inside of a cave to the smell of elk meat being cooked on a wood fire. As a young child, he contracted chicken pox. His grandmother and father had taken him into the sweat lodge and built a hot fire for him to sweat out the illness. While he had to stay inside, his father had told him stories as they ate jerked elk meat, and those were some of his most fond memories. After he ate and finished his broth, he adjusted himself, and he said, "When I first woke up, I thought that I had died and the trickster spirits were carrying me to the center of the land," he said. "Then I heard jumbled up English, and I thought that maybe there really was a devil and that I was headed for the white man's hell. Then I became so cold that I thought that the Norse god Loki had taken me to Helheim. Now I wake up and smell elk meat cooking and thought that I was back in the sweat lodge with my father and my grandmother. But now I see that I am actually in my body again with some familiar faces." When he saw Thomas, he asked, "Where's Jake? Did the Wendigos eat him?" When Jake heard Jimmy call his name, he whimpered. Thomas picked him up and sat him down beside Jimmy. As Jimmy laid there, he scratched the dog's ears, being careful not to touch Jake's lacerations on his head. Once again, Jake knew that he was a good boy. As the sun was fading into the west below the mountains, Danae and 2 other Sasquatch warriors entered the human's domicile. Each one sat down some of the lost backpacks and the weapons that the searchers had brought with them. Darkness was approaching. Danger was riding on its back. "Soon," announced Danae, "hunters will come. You village they hit," Danae said, pointing to the camp. Then pointing at the ground, he said, "Next hit Sasquatch, Skasquatch ready. Save women. Stay here until war gone. No leave. Washies and Umpqua safe." Standing near the same place where Thomas received his call, Emery received a satellite signal for his phone. He dialed in a coded number and was immediately connected to someone on the other end. Without any pleasant greetings, he informed the other party that there were about to be a raid on the Sinclair's campsite. He ordered the person there to contact the security chief on site and direct him to triple up his guard posts and to consider all bipedal canines hostile. He also directed the other party to consider all humanoids over 12 feet tall hostile, but that there may be allies arriving that were not hostile. Don't shoot anything until you see it eating other things, he instructed animately. Afterwards, Emery advised the other party that his party's location was about 8 miles north of the camp as the crow flies. He stated that they were on a precipice about 4,800 foot in elevation and to be aware of rocket fire in that direction. He also ordered that all within the camp stay at their battle stations until ordered to retreat. He stated that he would advise of any other intel as it became relevant to the camp. And before hanging up the phone, Emery's demeanor changed. He stopped being the commander and began using the terms "yes, ma'am" frequently. He ended the conversation with, "Me too, and I will." After hanging up the phone, Emery instructed Kevin and Owen to take a couple pairs of night vision binoculars and scan the wilderness around the Sinclair for any signs of movement. From their vantage point, the two could see for miles further than the security operative could in the camp. And next, Emery sent Eric and Easton around toward the eastern edge of the precipice to watch for movement there. Each man carried with him a Creedmoor 6.5 that was brought back along to him with their packs. The four men also searched their mollies until they found ear comms. They placed them in so that they could communicate, and Emery found another one in his pack. As the men spread out to monitor the wilderness around the Sinclair camp, Thomas stood in amazement at the precision with which each man worked. Their teamwork was like a well-oiled machine. Each man was just a part of the machine. Within the pile of equipment that was scavenged by the Sasquatch warriors from the razors, Thomas found his AA-12, his PCK, and his M203 rounds. He wasn't proficient in using the grenade launcher, but he was a proficient football player in high school. He remembered that the attendant had told him to aim downrange like throwing a football. Now, this meant that the grenade path had a noticeable arch to its trajectory. Thomas found himself planted behind a large boulder looking off towards the Sinclair party's last campsite. He was experiencing an adrenaline rush. Time seemed to stand still for him, but looking around, he took in how the other men had settled down to the task at hand. So he forced his nerves to do the same. Jimmy, who was still too weak to stand, asked Katie and Marianne to help him move over toward the opening in the cave. Although the cave entrance was hidden from the outside by a protective wall of stone, he found a good vantage point to observe the footpath that led up the mountain. He wasn't at his best, but Jimmy Stone refused to stay out of a fight where his friends needed him. As he watched the footpath leading from the cave to the mountain floor, he noticed how silently the Sasquatch warriors passed down to the forest. Even with his well-trained eyes, he often lost the warriors as they seemed to literally melt into the background. These were the guardians of the forest that his ancestor had talked about. Their words were all true. Now, Chapter 12, Oric's Revenge. After waiting 3 nights for the scouting party to return, Alpha decided to take his main force of hunters to the humans' village. He gave Beta strict orders that he and his scouts were to return within 3 nights, or he would consider them lost. In his mind, he decided that if they weren't dead yet, they would be when Oric finds out about their failures to attain their mission success. The time for action had come. Calling his fastest runner, he gave him instructions to return to Oric. And when he arrived, the runner was to inform Oric that the Sasquatch had already disposed of the face-eater bodies in an unknown way, and that he had lost his scouting party to them. If Alpha knew Oric well enough, the giant face-eater would demand to be led to the human village. Oric would demand his revenge. After his messenger was dispatched, Alpha called all of the hunters together and told them that they were going to the humans' village to destroy it and then move on to destroy Danae's stronghold. His strategy was simple. They were to stay inside of the shadows as much as possible. When they had crept up as closely as they could to the perimeter of the village, they would then attack from all sides at once. Silent encircling of the camp was the most dire plan for successfully destroying all the humans. He ordered a no-howling proclamation until after the battle had been engaged. Every hunter would travel in silence. Silently in small groups of 4 and 6 individuals, the hunters left the comfort of their cave dwelling. They were hungry, and tonight they planned to feast. Oric had become impatient, waiting for news of his son's return. After the second night without word about the whereabouts of Gawa and Oric's grandsons, he began the long trek down the mountain. As the sun began to peek over the mountaintops the next morning, Oric found the entrance of a cave that he once used as his primary abode. He hadn't been there in centuries, but the place hadn't changed since he was the last there, except for a thicker layer of dust that had settled along the floor of the cavern. And he sat down on the stone slabs that he had fashioned into his bed many years ago. He hadn't realized just how hard the rocks had become over the years. Then the realization struck him that the rocks had always been that hard. But in his younger centuries, they bothered him less because he was a stronger giant. Oric had just settled into his slumber when a lone wolf messenger ran by his hidden lair. After sunset, Oric arose and began his journey. Although he hadn't been to the human village, Oric could easily smell where the hunters had traveled, even though his eyes were too weak to see their footprints. As he lumbered along, he finally caught up with the last of the hunters from the main pack. He called to the closest one, which ran up to him like a submissive puppy. Oric ordered the hunter to lead him to the alpha wolf. Once the alpha saw his master approaching, he immediately ran to him and reported the situation. Oric was enraged when he heard that the Sasquatch warriors carried away the remains of his son and grandsons. However, due to the impending attack, he held his silent rage inside until the time came to attack the village. He was going to make every human pay for killing his son. He was going to make every Sasquatch warrior pay for killing his grandsons. However, he was going to make Danae suffer before he died. Death may even be too good for Danae. Oric may just make him watch as his hunters kill the whole family. Then, Oric may just bite off Danae's legs and watch his crippled body as it scars over the chewed stumps. While Oric was still planning his revenge, a forward scout came and reported to Alpha that there were more humans inside of the village than there were originally. He also stated that these humans seemed to be expecting trouble and had surrounded their village with the same type of rolling boulders that had glowing eyes as the original Washies used. The eyeshine reached them much farther out into the underbrush than the circle of light from the original fire that the Washies first used. The scout also reported that the humans had used their magic to float tiny suns above their village. And those tiny suns were shining light all throughout the village and even into the tree line around their village. None of this mattered to Oric. The giant's bloodlust had made him unable to see past his desire to punish. As the stealthy invaders made their way towards the Sinclair camp, they noticed that any activities that they had observed before had ceased. What was once a hotbed of activity reported to Alpha as an anthill that had been stepped on was now more like a winter termite mound. Everything was eerily silent within the perimeter of the village. What humans could be observed were accompanied by leashed patrolling dogs. There were 36 of the dogs. There were half a dozen dogs stationed on each side of the village, with at least another dozen patrolling inside the main body of the area. These were just an annoyance to Alpha. The Washi hunters were different than his hunters, Alpha thought. They were just mindless four-leggeds that did what their Washi masters told them to do without having to think for themselves. He especially despised them because they reminded him too much of the control that Oric held over his people. His ancestors had to submit to the face-eaters to survive, but they refused to cower down before them, as these four-legged ones did to their masters. His hatred was primal. His dismissal was voluntary. The only comfort he allowed himself was the fact that before long he would be able to rip them all apart. The smell of their blood mixing with his fur would be delicious, he thought. Oric sat silently in the background as he watched the wolf hunters silently surround the village. He was also curious about what magic these washies had that allowed them to control suns. Had they really been able to reach out into the sky far enough to grab their own stars? How could they hold them without burning up their hands? More importantly, how could he gain this magic so that he could grab the sun and hold it within his hands? If he could do that, Oric decided that he would be omnipotent. Could no one but the Eternal One hold the sun in his hands? Should he achieve this, he would be the king of the world. The more he contemplated this, the more his greed for power fueled his ego. Oric thought about the washies as he waited for his hunters to surround their village. How had such puny creatures learned to do such great magic, he wondered. He had been in these mountains apart from them for many years. The last washies he saw had used four-leggeds to pull their belongings tied to sticks. How had these small and bald creatures learned to power their tents with the sun? Why did their tents groan so loudly? Were they being forced to work like the washies forced the four-leggeds to carry their things? How could something in such constant pain or agony not die? These washies must be evil, thought Oric. They're not even concerned that their actions are creating so much agony upon their beast of burden. It was beyond Oric's comprehension how such tiny creatures could cause such blatant harm to other things around them and not show any indication of concern for the constant growling and huffing of their creatures. Oric wasn't concerned with the welfare of the beasts of burden within the Washi camp. Rather, he was interested in learning how to gain such power to exert over others. Well, guys, we got a big battle coming, sounds like. It'll be an interesting story next time I see you. So come on back. We'll do the same thing again. Bring some friends. Bring some family. They'll enjoy it too. This is kind of a story for all. Well, until then, folks, be good and have a nice time. This is Clay Steele. Good night.